After 8 years in a coma, a billionaire about to be taken off life support is stunned when an unknown boy enters the hospital and makes the unbelievable happen. The silence in room 507 of St. Luke's Hospital was interrupted only by the monotonous beep of cardiac monitors. The white curtains filtered the sunlight, trying to enter that sterile environment. Seated in a worn leather armchair, Lucy Norton absently flipped through a fashion magazine while occasionally glancing at the motionless figure in the bed. Edward Norton, her uncle, had lain there like a statue for 8 years. The doctors said it was a miracle his body still resisted, but to Lucy it seemed more like a sentence. She tucked her dark hair behind her ear and sighed deeply. She was the only family member who still made the weekly visits religiously, even though Edward, at 63, had never shown affection for her or any other family member. "Is Mr. Anthony coming to pick you up?" asked Josephine the nurse, entering the room with a tray of medications. "Yes, but only at 4. "I still have an hour," replied Lucy, putting the magazine aside. "Any news?" Josephine shook her head. She had worked at that hospital for 15 years and had cared for Edward since the beginning. "Yesterday's tests showed no change. Dr. Mitchell wants to speak with the family tomorrow. It seems that—" The nurse didn't finish her sentence, but she didn't need to. Lucy understood well what was coming. After years of waiting, the doctors had finally decided to initiate procedures to disconnect the machines. The businessman showed no improvement, and the legal resources that maintained that situation were exhausted. "Do you think he feels anything?" asked Lucy, observing her uncle's pale, impassive face, his once black hair now completely grey. "They say they hear everything," replied Josephine, checking the drip of the IV. "That's why I always talk to him while I perform procedures. I tell him about soap operas, talk about the weather. You never know." When the nurse left, Lucy approached the bed. Unlike most family members, she didn't harbour hopes. She knew Edward well before the sudden collapse that had left him in that state. The Shark of Wall Street, as he was known, had built an empire based on cold and often cruel decisions. The Norton Empire had branches in various sectors, from construction to agribusiness, and Edward commanded everything with an iron fist. "Tomorrow they're going to discuss the machines," she said, more to break the silence than believing he could hear. "Richard and Philip will attend this time. I think they feel it's time to close this chapter." Outside, the New York sky was beginning to cloud over. A fine drizzle, typical of the city, drummed against the window. Lucy checked her watch. Still, 40 minutes before Mr. Anthony, the driver, would arrive. She took out her phone to check her emails when she heard a noise in the corridor. It wasn't the usual sound of gurneys or medication carts. It seemed they were light, almost furtive footsteps. The door to the room opened slowly. Lucy looked up, expecting to see a doctor or nurse, but who entered left her completely speechless. It was a boy, appearing no more than 10 years old. Barefoot, wearing a worn white t-shirt and faded denim shorts, he had disheveled brown hair and intensely green eyes. The most disconcerting thing was the naturalness with which he entered that ICU room, where access was strictly controlled. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" Lucy asked, recovering from her initial shock. The boy didn't answer. He walked calmly to Edward's bed, observing the machines with curiosity. His bare feet made no sound on the cold floor. Lucy stood up, torn between calling security and observing this surreal scene. "Boy, you can't be here. This is a restricted room," she said, trying to sound firm, but something about the child's presence prevented her from being more forceful. The boy finally looked at her. His green eyes seemed to contain wisdom disproportionate to his age. Without saying a word, he turned his attention back to Edward and, to Lucy's astonishment, placed his small hand on the businessman's arm. "Let me help him?" he asked in a soft but determined voice. Before Lucy could react, all the monitors in the room began to trigger alarms. The numbers on the displays fluctuated frantically. Edward's body, motionless for so long, trembled slightly. Lucy ran to the door, shouting for help, while the boy remained impassive, his hand still touching the businessman's arm. When the medical team rushed into the room, led by Dr. Mitchell, Lucy pointed to the bed, wanting to explain about the intruding Boy. But the words died in her throat. The boy had disappeared. There was no sign of him in the room, as if he had never been there. "The vital signs are stabilizing," exclaimed a nurse, checking the monitors. "This is impossible," murmured Dr. Mitchell, examining Edward's pupils. He's responding to stimuli." To everyone's amazement, Edward Norton's eyes, closed for 8 long years, began to open slowly. First a tremor in the eyelids, then a hesitant movement, like someone awakening from a deep sleep. The doctors and nurses worked frantically around him, checking vital signs, adjusting equipment, while Lucy remained, petrified by the door. "Uncle Edward?" she whispered, unable to believe what she was seeing. His eyes, once so penetrating and intimidating, now seemed lost, confused. He blinked several times, trying to adjust to the light. His dry lips moved, trying to form words that wouldn't come. "Don't try to speak now," Dr. Mitchell advised, leaning over him. "You've been unconscious for a very long time. Let's take it slow." But Edward seemed determined. With visible effort, he managed to emit a hoarse, almost inaudible sound. Everyone in the room leaned in, trying to understand. The boy," he whispered. "Where is the boy?" Lucy felt a shiver run down her spine. How could Edward know about the boy? He was in a coma when the boy entered the room. It was scientifically impossible that he would be aware of what had happened. "What boy, Mr. Norton?" asked Dr. Mitchell, casting a confused look at the team. Edward didn't answer. His eyes moved around the room, as if searching for something or someone. Finally, his gaze met Lucy's, and she saw something she never imagined seeing in the eyes of the feared businessman: vulnerability. In the hours that followed, St. Luke's Hospital transformed into a whirlwind. Specialist doctors were called to evaluate the miracle, as some were already calling it. Journalists began to gather in the reception, eager for information about the billionaire's sudden awakening. Lucy, now accompanied by her cousins Richard and Philip, who came rushing when they heard the news, tried to handle the situation while processing what she had witnessed. "But who exactly was this boy you saw?" asked Richard, direct heir of Edward, and current interim president of Norton Enterprises. At 45, he carried many of his father's characteristics: the authoritarian posture, the calculating gaze, the unbridled ambition. "I don't know," replied Lucy for the 3rd time. "He simply appeared, touched Uncle Edward, and then vanished." "The security cameras must have recorded something," suggested Philip, the youngest of the 3, always practical and methodical. But when they checked the recordings, they discovered something even more intriguing. There was no record of the boy. The cameras in the corridor at reception, at the hospital entrances, none had captured his image. It was as if he were a ghost, invisible to electronic eyes. Meanwhile, in room 507, Edward Norton was beginning his slow journey back to the world of the living. Each movement was a challenge after 8 years of immobility. Each word, an achievement. But there was something different about him, something the doctors couldn't explain and that the family hadn't yet noticed. In his eyes, once cold and calculating, there was now a flame of restlessness, a constant search, as if upon awakening he had brought with him an essential question, a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. In the early hours of that same day, when only a rookie nurse was making rounds, Edward managed to mumble a few more coherent words. "He came back, after so long. Charlie came back." The nurse noted the words in the chart, without understanding their meaning. He didn't know that name, Charlie, hadn't been mentioned by Edward Norton for more than 50 years. He didn't know that name was buried under layers and layers of suppressed memories, of unresolved guilt, of a past that the powerful businessman had done everything to forget. Outside, the New York drizzle had turned into a storm. Lightning, intermittently, illuminated the room through the slats of the blinds. In one of these flashes, for just a moment, the silhouette of a boy seemed to project itself on the white wall. But when the nurse looked, there was nothing there except the dancing shadows of the medical equipment. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. 2. Weeks after the inexplicable awakening, Edward Norton demanded medical discharge, against all the recommendations of the team that accompanied him. His body, debilitated by years of inactivity, could barely support itself, but his mind seemed feverish, dominated by an urgency that no one understood. "You need at least another month of intensive physiotherapy," argued Dr. Mitchell, holding the chart like a shield. "Your muscles have atrophied, your immune system is fragile. It's a miracle that you've recovered so much cognitive function, but physically—" "I'll sign any liability waiver," interrupted Edward, his voice still hoarse, "from the long period without use. I'll hire a private team. I have urgent matters that can't wait." Seated in the room's armchair, Lucy observed the scene with a mixture of admiration and concern. Her uncle had always been obstinate, but now there was something different, almost obsessive about his behavior. Since regaining consciousness, he constantly asked about the boy, describing him with details he would have been impossible to know if he had really been unconscious during the apparition. "Uncle, Dr. Mitchell is right," she tried to intervene. "The Westchester mansion is being prepared to receive you, but we need time to adapt everything, hire nurses, physiotherapists." Edward turned to his niece, and for a moment his gaze softened. It was strange how, since the awakening, he seemed to notice Lucy's presence in a way he had never done before. Throughout her life she had been just the distant niece, daughter of his sister, who had distanced herself from the family after disagreements with the direction of Norton's businesses. "Lucy, I need to find him," said Edward in a low voice, as if sharing a secret. "You saw him. You know I'm not imagining things." She swallowed hard. It was true. Despite the cameras not having recorded anything, despite no one else in the hospital having seen the mysterious boy, she knew he was real. She could still feel the chill she had felt when his green eyes met hers. "Richard has already arranged everything," she finally yielded. "If you insist, we can leave the hospital tomorrow." The journey to the Westchester mansion was made in silence. Edward observed the city through the car window with the eyes of someone seeing everything for the first time. New York had changed in those 8 years. New skyscrapers dotted the horizon, avenues had been widened, subway stations inaugurated. "It looks like a different place," he murmured, more to himself than to Lucy, seated beside him in the back seat of the armored Mercedes. "A lot has changed, Uncle. You'll see when we get home. Richard made some renovations, modernized the systems." Edward didn't respond, his gaze fixed on a point on the sidewalk where a boy of about 10 walked hand in hand with his mother. For a moment his heart accelerated, but he soon realized it wasn't the same boy. This one had darker hair, wore colorful sneakers, smiled carelessly. He didn't possess that aura of mystery, that penetrating gaze that the hospital visitor carried. The Norton Mansion was an imposing neoclassical construction, surrounded by a meticulously maintained garden and protected by high walls and state-of-the-art security systems. When the car stopped in front of the main gate, Edward felt a tightness in his chest. This place, which should be his home, seemed strangely hostile now. "We prepared the main bedroom on the ground floor," explained Lucy, as the driver opened the door. "So you won't need to climb stairs at this first moment." A small entourage waited at the entrance, Richard with his impeccable suit and rehearsed smile, Philip, more discreet, observing everything with analytical eyes, Mrs. Margaret, the housekeeper who had served the family for 3 decades, and a team of nurses and physiotherapists hired for Edward's recovery. "Welcome back, Father," said Richard, stepping forward to help Edward out of the car. "You can't imagine how we've waited for this moment." Edward accepted his son's support, but his eyes wandered around the property as if looking for something or someone. "Where is Helen?" he suddenly asked, referring to his ex-wife whom he had divorced more than 15 years ago after a marriage marked by infidelities and emotional distance. An awkward silence fell over the group. It was Philip who finally answered. "Mom." "Has been in Paris for a few years, Uncle. After the accident, she preferred to distance herself." Edward nodded, without showing any emotion. Deep down, he didn't expect Helen to be there. His marriage had always been more of a business, arrangement than an emotional union. The daughter of an important banker, Helen had brought valuable connections to Norton's businesses, but there had never been true love between them. The first days at the mansion were torment for everyone. Edward, impatient with his physical limitations, demanded to advance in physiotherapy exercises beyond what was recommended. He insisted on walking alone, even when his legs faltered. He refused to use a wheelchair, even for longer journeys. His determination was admirable, but concerning. More disturbing still was his behavior during the nights. He insisted on staying awake until late, sitting by the window overlooking the garden, as if waiting for someone's arrival. Sometimes the nurses found him wandering the corridors of the mansion, murmuring the name Charlie. On one of these nights, Lucy, who had decided to stay at the mansion to help with her uncle's recovery, found him in the office, rummaging through old boxes of documents. "Uncle Edward, it's almost 3 in the morning. You should be resting." He looked up, and Lucy noticed how feverish, almost obsessive his eyes seemed. Around him, papers were scattered on the floor, old photographs, documents yellowed by time. "I need to find something, Lucy, something that will confirm I'm not crazy." She approached cautiously. Edward had always been a reserved man who maintained emotional distance from everyone. Seeing him like this, vulnerable and almost desperate, was disconcerting. "What exactly are you looking for?" Edward hesitated, as if pondering how much he could trust her. Finally, he took one of the photographs and extended it to his niece. "This is me at 12, he said, pointing to a thin boy with dark hair. "And this beside me is Charlie." Lucy examined the photograph carefully. It showed 2 smiling boys in front of a lake, wearing swimming trunks with fishing rods in their hands. The other boy, Charlie, had light brown hair and a broad smile that lit up his face. There was something familiar about him, something that made Lucy furrow her brow. "He looks like—" "Yes," interrupted Edward, with urgency in his voice. "He's identical to the boy you saw at the hospital. The same one that no one else could see, that didn't appear on any security camera." Lucy felt a chill. It was true. The resemblance was undeniable, almost supernatural. The boy in the photograph, taken more than 50 years ago, could perfectly well be the same one who had mysteriously entered the hospital room. "Who is he, Uncle? Who is Charlie?" Edward closed his eyes for a moment, as if the answer caused him physical pain. "He was my best friend, my only true friend. We grew up together on my grandfather's farm in Riverdale. We were inseparable until—" His voice faltered. He took back the photograph, caressing it with trembling fingers. "Until that summer. I was 12, Charlie 11. It was infernally hot, and we decided to swim in the lake even knowing it was forbidden. I was always the bolder one, the one who defied the rules. Charlie was more cautious, but he followed me in all adventures." Edward paused, breathing deeply. Lucy waited, feeling that she was about to hear something her uncle had never shared with anyone. The lake seemed calm, but it had treacherous currents. I entered without fear, swam to the middle. Charlie stayed at the shore, hesitant. I mocked. Called him a coward. Finally he entered. And then— Again Edward interrupted himself. His hands clutched the photograph so tightly that Lucy feared he would tear it. I began to drown. I don't know how, but suddenly I was being pulled. Down? I remember the panic, the water entering my lungs, and then Charlie swimming in my direction, shouting my name. He managed to push me to the shore, but— Edward didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Lucy understood what had happened. Charlie had saved Edward's life, but couldn't save his own. "He was never found," concluded Edward with a choked voice. "The searches lasted weeks, but the body never appeared. My grandfather forbade that the subject be mentioned. He said it was better to forget, to move on. We moved to New York the following month. I never returned to that farm." Lucy sat beside her uncle, processing that revelation. Suddenly, many things began to make sense. Edward's obsession with control, his inability to form true emotional bonds, the coldness with which he treated everyone, as if he feared getting too close. "Do you believe the boy from the hospital was Charlie?" she asked hesitantly. Edward raised his eyes, which now seemed more lucid, more determined. I don't just believe, Lucy. I'm certain. I don't know how. I don't know why, but he came back, and I need to find him again. That same night, after Edward finally agreed to rest, Lucy returned to the office. Something in her uncle's story intrigued her deeply. If Charlie had drowned in that distant lake, how could he have appeared at the hospital? And why now, so many years later? While organizing the scattered documents, a sheet of paper caught her attention. It was a child's drawing, made with colored pencils, two figures holding hands in front of a blue lake. On the back, a date, January 15th, 1975, and an inscription in childish handwriting, "For Edward, my best friend forever, Charlie." Lucy carefully saved the drawing. She was about to close the last box when she noticed something strange, a sweet, almost sugary smell that wasn't there before. And then, in the antique mirror hung on the opposite wall, she saw something that made her blood freeze. Reflected in the mirror was not only her image, but also that of a green-eyed boy standing right behind her. When Lucy turned abruptly, there was no one there. But upon looking back at the mirror, the fogged message was clear, as if written with a finger on the glass. He needs to remember everything. The news of Edward Norton's miraculous awakening spread quickly through New York's business circles. After 3 weeks of seclusion in the Westchester mansion, rumors about his mental and physical state multiplied. Some said he had returned completely lucid, ready to reassume control of his empire. Others claimed he was senile, unable to recognize his own family members. The truth, as always, was somewhere between these extremes. In his adapted bedroom on the ground floor of the mansion, Edward advanced in his physical recovery with fierce determination. His physiotherapist, Dr. Fernanda Bowman, a middle-aged woman with years of experience in complex cases, was impressed with his progress. "You're exceeding all expectations," she commented, as she observed him walking with the aid of a cane through the indoor garden. "Last week you could barely stand for 5 minutes. Today you've already completed 15 minutes of walking." Edward merely nodded, concentrating on each step. His mind was far away, absorbed in memories and unanswered questions. Since the night he revealed to Lucy about Charlie, he felt lighter, as if he had removed a stone he had been carrying for decades, but also more restless, more determined to understand what was happening. "Dr. Bowman," he said, stopping to catch his breath, "when will I be able to dispense with this cane?" "At this rate, perhaps in 2 weeks. But we shouldn't rush things. Your body—" "I don't have 2 weeks," interrupted Edward, with that urgency that had become his trademark since the awakening. "I need to be strong enough to travel soon." The physiotherapist frowned, concerned. "Travel? You've barely begun your recovery. A trip now would be extremely risky." Edward didn't respond. He knew no one would understand the need that consumed him. He needed to return to Riverdale, to his grandfather's old farm, to the lake where everything had happened. Something told him that only there would he find the answers he sought. Later, in the office converted into a meeting room to accommodate him, Edward received a visit from Richard and Leonard Mendoza, his old partner and current vice president of Norton Enterprises. The tension in the environment was palpable. Leonard, a 60-year-old man with an astute expression and impeccable suit, observed Edward like a scientist analyzing a rare specimen. "It's good to see you recovering so well, Edward," said Leonard, with that calculated smile that Edward knew all too well. "We all missed you in business." "I'm sure you did," replied Edward dryly. During the coma, Richard and Leonard had assumed total control of the companies. Edward still hadn't had time to thoroughly examine the decisions made in his absence, but the preliminary reports that Lucy had brought him already indicated significant changes in direction. "We've come to discuss an exceptional opportunity," introduced Richard, opening a folder of documents on the table. "The Nakamura Group from Japan is interested in a merger with our technology division. The numbers are impressive, Father. We would be talking about an initial capital injection in the billions." Edward took the documents, leafing through them without much interest. Before the coma, a proposal of this magnitude would have captured all his attention. Now it seemed strangely insignificant. "What else?" he asked, sensing that something unsaid was hanging in the air. Leonard and Richard exchanged quick glances. It was Leonard who finally exposed the rest of the plan. To make the merger viable, we would need to reorganize the company's structure. This would involve some cuts. How many? Approximately 3,000 employees at the factories in Stamford and Bridgeport, replied Richard, maintaining a neutral tone, as if talking about numbers on a spreadsheet, not families that would lose their source of livelihood. But they would be strategic cuts necessary for the modernization of the company. Edward leaned back in his chair, observing the two men in front of him. He recognized in them the same ambitious gleam that had once dominated his own eyes, the same willingness to sacrifice anything in the name of profit and expansion. "And the local suppliers?" he asked, remembering the dozens of small businesses that depended on contracts with the Norton Group. "They would be gradually replaced by international partners," explained Leonard, with that condescending tone he used when he thought Edward wasn't comprehending the magnitude of the deal. "It's a natural movement in a merger of this size. The Japanese have their own supply network, much more efficient and cheaper," completed Edward, closing the folder of documents. "I understand perfectly what you're proposing, Leonard. I'm not senile, just re-evaluating priorities." An uncomfortable silence settled in the room. Richard, clearly impatient, decided to press. "We need your signature by the end of the week, Father. The Japanese have other interested parties and won't wait indefinitely." Edward looked out the window at the garden where birds played carelessly among the flowers. A strange sensation took hold of him, as if he were observing his own life from the outside, seeing clearly for the first time. "No," he said simply. "What do you mean, no?" Richard stood up, his face reddened by frustration. "Have you even read the numbers? This merger would double the market value of the companies in less than 2 years, at the cost of thousands of jobs and dozens of small business owners who have trusted us for decades," replied Edward, with a calmness that surprised even himself. "I won't sign." Leonard intervened, using his most persuasive tone. "Edward, I know your recovery has been difficult. Perhaps you're being hasty in refusing a proposal of this magnitude without analyzing it adequately. Why not take a few days to think it over? We can come back next week and—" "There will be no next week for this matter, Leonard," cut Edward, standing up with effort, supported by his cane. "My decision is made, and furthermore, I want a complete audit of all decisions made during my absence, especially those that involved layoffs or closing of units." Richard visibly paled. "Father, this is absurd. We administered the companies in the best possible way during your absence. We followed the same philosophy that you always preached: maximum efficiency, minimum costs, profitability first." His son's words hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. It was true. That had been his philosophy for decades. He had built an empire following exactly these principles, never questioning the human impact of his decisions. And now, ironically, it was the same Richard, molded in his image and likeness, who threw them back in his face. "Things have changed, Richard," said Edward, feeling the weight of each word. "I have changed." After the two men left, visibly displeased, Edward remained in the office, lost in thought. Around him, the walls covered with diplomas, certificates, and photos of inaugurations seemed to tell the story of a stranger, not his own. A light knock on the door interrupted his reflections. It was Lucy, bringing a cup of tea. "I heard raised voices," she commented, placing the cup on the table. "Richard left here furious." Edward smiled slightly. He never dealt well with contradictions. In that, unfortunately, he takes after his father. Lucy sat across from him, studying him with curiosity. "You seem different today, more serene." "I made some decisions," replied Edward, sipping the tea. "Decisions I perhaps should have made a long time ago." Before he could elaborate, his cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. Edward answered, putting it on speakerphone due to difficulty in holding the device for long. "Mr. Norton," a male voice, deep and professional, sounded through the room. "This is Marcus Sanders, from Sanders Investigations. Miss Lucy hired me for a special service." Edward looked at his niece, surprised. She merely gestured for him to continue the conversation. "What kind of service, Mr. Sanders?" "Investigation of an old case. A disappearance that occurred in 1975 in the Riverdale region. A boy named Charlie Oliver." Edward's heart accelerated. For decades, no one had mentioned Charlie's full name in his presence. "And what did you discover?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Preliminary information for now. I confirm that the case was archived after 2 months of fruitless searches. The body was never found, which generated various theories at the time. The most accepted was drowning, with the body carried by the current to a hard-to-access area of the river." Edward closed his eyes, recalling the fateful day. The suffocating heat, the cool water, the sensation of panic upon feeling himself sinking, Charlie's determined face swimming in his direction. "Is there anything else, Mr. Sanders?" asked Lucy, noticing her uncle's pallor. "Yes, I found something curious in the records. According to witnesses of the time, especially farm employees, the boy Charlie had tried to warn about the dangers of the lake days before. Apparently, he had a dream, or a premonition as some called it, that something bad would happen in that lake." A chill ran down Edward's spine. He had never known this. Charlie had never told him about any dream or premonition. "And there's more," continued the investigator. "The Oliver family still exists. Charlie's mother, Mrs. Constance, is alive. She's 92 years old and lives in a retirement home in Riverdale." Edward nearly dropped the teacup. Charlie's mother, alive! He vaguely remembered her, a kind woman with an easy smile who always welcomed them with little cakes when they returned from their adventures around the farm. "I need to speak with her," said Edward with urgency in his voice. "Immediately." "I've already taken the liberty of scheduling a visit," replied Sanders. "If you can travel to Riverdale next week." "We'll go tomorrow," interrupted Edward, ignoring Lucy's concerned look. "Prepare everything, Mr. Sanders. I'll pay whatever is necessary." After hanging up, a heavy silence settled in the office. Lucy observed her uncle, divided between concern for his health and curiosity about the mystery that enveloped them. "Thank you," Edward finally said, taking his niece's hand between his. "For understanding, for helping." "You would have done the same for me," she replied, although they both knew that wasn't true. The old Edward would never have involved himself in emotional issues of any family member. Business always came first. That night, while preparing a small suitcase for the unexpected trip, Edward felt a presence in the room. It wasn't a threatening sensation. On the contrary, it brought with it a comforting familiarity. "You're here, aren't you?" he asked the apparent emptiness. "You brought me back for some reason, Charlie." There was no audible response, but the temperature of the room seemed to decrease slightly. The old clock on the dresser, stopped for years, suddenly began to work again with a rhythmic tick-tock, and on the fogged surface of the bathroom mirror, when Edward went to brush his teeth, a message slowly appeared. "It's time to fix things." Edward remained motionless, staring at those simple but meaning-laden words. He didn't feel fear, which was surprising in itself. Instead, a growing determination took hold of him. Yes, it was time to fix things, all of them, starting with what had happened in that distant lake so many decades ago. Upon returning to the bedroom, he found something on the bed that wasn't there before, a small paper boat, folded simply but precisely, exactly like the ones he and Charlie used to make on rainy afternoons at the farm when they couldn't play outside. Edward picked up the little boat carefully, as if it were the most precious relic. A melancholic smile drew itself on his aged face. Tomorrow he would begin a journey that should have started 50 years ago, a journey of redemption. The trip to Riverdale began at dawn. Against all medical recommendations, Edward insisted on making the journey by car instead of helicopter. He wanted to see the landscape, reconnect with the path he had taken for the last time at 12 years old, when he left behind not only his grandfather's farm, but also the most authentic part of himself. "You should rest," suggested Lucy, noticing the fatigue on her uncle's face after 2 hours of travel. "We can stop at a hotel and continue tomorrow." Edward declined with a gesture. With each mile they approached Riverdale, he felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The New York countryside had changed drastically. Where there were once only sugarcane plantations, now residential condominiums and commercial centers arose. But in some stretches, the landscape still preserved that green vastness that populated his childhood memories. It was all so different, he murmured, more to himself than to Lucy. So simple. We spent days exploring the cane fields, building huts in the woods, fishing in the creek. "You and Charlie?" asked Lucy softly, taking advantage of this rare moment of openness. Edward nodded, a melancholic smile on his lips. We were inseparable. Charlie was the cook's son at the farm. Theoretically, we shouldn't even play together. My grandfather had very rigid ideas about social classes, but I was too stubborn to obey. Lucy smiled, imagining Edward as a rebellious child, so different from the calculating and controlling man she had known. "How did you become friends?" "It was on a rainy day. I was 6 years old and bored, confined to the main house while the storm fell outside. I sneaked into the kitchen looking for sweets and found Charlie hidden under the table drawing on an old piece of paper. He had just arrived at the farm with his mother, who had been hired as a cook after becoming a widow." Edward paused, lost in memories. He showed me his drawings. They were little boats, dozens of them, all sailing on the blue sea. He said he dreamed of building a real boat one day big enough to sail around the world. I found the idea fascinating. That same afternoon we began to plan our future maritime adventures. The car rounded a roundabout and entered a secondary road, less paved. The driver reduced speed, concerned with the comfort of the passengers. "Did your grandfather never discover the friendship?" asked Lucy. "Oh, he discovered. It was impossible to hide anything on that farm. The employees were too afraid of him not to report my escapes. There was a severe punishment I remember well. I was locked in my room for a week, could only leave for meals. But not even that separated us. Charlie discovered he could climb the mango tree in the garden and enter through my bedroom window. We spent hours playing checkers and inventing stories, while my grandfather thought I was alone, reflecting on my inappropriate behavior." Lucy laughed, imagining the scene. It was difficult to reconcile this image of a fearless and loyal boy with the ruthless businessman Edward had become. As if reading her thoughts, he continued, "I know what you're thinking. How that boy transformed into the man you knew. Truth is that after what happened to Charlie, something broke in me. My grandfather took the opportunity to mold me in his image, cold, calculating, focused only on material success. And I let him. It was easier than dealing with the guilt." Before Lucy could respond, the driver announced they had arrived. The Holy Cecilia home was a large and well-maintained building, surrounded by flowery gardens. Despite the welcoming appearance, Edward felt a tightness in his chest as he passed through the gates. He was about to face the past in a way he had never imagined. At reception, investigator Marcus Sanders was already waiting for them. He was a middle-aged man with attentive eyes that seemed to capture every detail. "Mr. Norton, Miss Lucy," he greeted with a formal nod. "Mrs. Constance is expecting us. I should warn that she has good days and bad days. Today seems to be a good day, but even so, her memory may fluctuate." Edward breathed deeply, trying to control the tremor in his hands. It wasn't just the physical fragility after the long coma. It was the emotional weight of that encounter. "How did she react when she knew I was coming?" he asked. Sanders hesitated briefly. "She smiled, said she had been expecting this visit for a long time." Those words sent a shiver down Edward's spine. How could Mrs. Constance be expecting his visit? He himself had only decided to come yesterday, after discovering she was still alive. They followed a corridor decorated with colorful paintings made by the residents themselves. Upon reaching a private living room, Sanders knocked softly on the half-open door. "Mrs. Constance, the visitors you were expecting have arrived." Edward entered hesitantly, leaning on his cane. Seated by the window in a rocking chair was a very elderly lady. Her hair, completely white, was arranged in a simple bun. Despite her advanced age, her eyes, of an intense green, identical to Charlie's, maintained a surprising vivacity when her gaze met Edward's. A smile illuminated her wrinkled face. "Edward Norton," she said, with a voice that, although fragile, carried an unexpected firmness. "The boy who wanted to conquer the world." Edward felt his legs weaken. Lucy quickly pulled a chair for him to sit. "Mrs. Constance," he finally managed to say. "It's an honor to finally meet you again." The elderly woman tilted her head slightly, as if assessing the sincerity of those words. "It took too long, didn't it? But he always said you would come eventually." A heavy silence fell over the room. Edward exchanged a quick look with Lucy, who seemed as perplexed as he was. "Charlie said that?" asked Edward, his voice almost failing. Mrs. Constance nodded, her gaze softening. "In my dreams. He comes to visit me for years. Always smiling, always tranquil. 'Mother,' he says, 'Edward will need help one day. And when that day comes, tell him the truth.'" Edward leaned forward, his heart beating so hard he feared everyone in the room could hear it. "What truth, Mrs. Constance?" The elderly woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if seeking strength for what she was about to reveal. When she reopened them, they seemed more intense, more present. Charlie knew something would happen that day. Edward. A week before, he woke up screaming in the middle of the night. He said he had dreamed about the lake, about dark water pulling you down. I tried to convince him it was just a nightmare, but he insisted. "I see things, Mother," he told me. "I always have. Things that haven't happened yet." Edward felt a chill. He vaguely remembered occasions when Charlie seemed to predict small events, a sudden rain, an unexpected visit from a relative, a stray puppy they would find abandoned in the field. At the time, he considered it luck or coincidence. "He had premonitions?" asked Lucy, fascinated by the turn of the conversation. Mrs. Constance smiled sadly. "We called them that, yes. It came from his father's family, this sensitivity. My husband also had it, though weaker. Charlie was special. He saw beyond the veil, as my grandmother used to say." "And he predicted the accident at the lake," concluded Edward, feeling the weight of guilt grow in his chest. "He knew I would drown, and yet he went with you," completed Mrs. Constance, "because he also knew he could save you. What he didn't tell, not even to me, was the price he would pay." Silent tears began to stream down the elderly woman's wrinkled face. Edward felt his own eyes well up. Something that hadn't happened since childhood. "Why did you never contact me?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "After the accident, after we moved to New York." "Oh, I tried," she replied, with a touch of bitterness. "I went to the Norton mansion in the city. Your grandfather received me. He said you were in a boarding school in Switzerland and didn't want to be reminded of what happened. He offered me money so I would never try to contact you again." Edward closed his eyes, feeling a wave of anger against his already deceased grandfather. One more lie, one more manipulation. There was never a boarding school in Switzerland, just private tutors at the mansion and later an elite school in New York, where he learned to be as cold and calculating as the family patriarch. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I never knew you tried to contact me. My grandfather, he controlled every aspect of my life at that time." Mrs. Constance nodded, understanding. "I imagined, but deep down, I always knew that one day we would meet again. Charlie ensured that." "How so?" asked Edward, confused. The elderly woman extended a trembling hand, taking something from the small table beside her. It was a carved wooden box, small and worn by time. She offered it to Edward. "He left this for you. On the eve of that day, he placed it in my hands and said, 'Keep it until Edward comes to get it, Mother. He will need this to understand.'" With trembling hands, Edward accepted the box. It weighed more than it appeared. He looked at Mrs. Constance, silently asking permission to open it, and she nodded. Inside the box, on a piece of faded velvet, was a silver medallion in an oval shape. Edward recognized it immediately. It was the amulet that Charlie always carried with him, an inheritance from his father. On the front, engraved in relief, was the drawing of a sailboat. Edward turned the medallion, and on the back read the inscription in small but well-defined letters, "The true treasure never sinks." "He never took this off his neck," murmured Edward, feeling the cold metal against his fingers. "He said it protected him from all evil." "And it did," replied Mrs. Constance with surprising conviction, "just not in the way we expected." Edward looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" The elderly woman leaned forward, lowering her voice as if sharing a precious secret. "Charlie didn't leave this world that day, Edward. He just changed form on purpose." A profound silence fell over the room. Lucy, who until then had only observed, felt a shiver run down her spine. The elderly woman's words, as fantastic as they seemed, echoed with an inexplicable truth. "Are you saying that?" began Edward, unable to formulate the complete question. "I'm saying that my son chose his path that day. He saved you, yes. But he also made a pact, one that I only understood years later, when I began to dream of him. Charlie became a guardian. Edward, a protector. And you were his most important mission." Edward felt his head spin. It was all too surreal, impossible to believe. And yet, how to explain the boy in the hospital? How to explain his miraculous awakening after 8 years in a coma? "Why now?" he finally managed to ask. "Why did he come back now after so many years?" Mrs. Constance smiled, a smile that mixed sadness and a strange peace. "Because you were finally ready to listen. And because your time is not yet over, Edward Norton, there is much to be done, much to be fixed." She paused, looking at the window, where the afternoon sun illuminated the garden. "Charlie always saw beyond, in time, in space, in people. He saw something in you that even you couldn't see, a potential for good that was suffocated, but never completely extinguished." Edward held the medallion tightly, as if he could extract answers from it. "What should I do now?" "You already know the answer to that question," replied the elderly woman, with that serene wisdom that only the very old possess. "That's why you're here. That's why you refuse the deal with the Japanese. That's why you look at your past life with new eyes." Edward opened his eyes wide. "How do you know about the deal with the Japanese?" An enigmatic smile drew itself on the wrinkled face. "I said Charlie visits me in dreams. He tells me many things." She paused, observing him attentively. "There is one more place you need to visit before returning to New York, a place you know well." "The lake," said Edward immediately, feeling a tightness in his chest. "I need to go to the lake." Mrs. Constance nodded slowly. "The farm no longer exists as you knew it. It was sold, transformed into a sugar cane plant. But the lake is still there, untouched. Some places carry memories too powerful to be altered." When they said goodbye, the elderly woman held Edward's hands between hers, surprisingly firm for someone her age. "He is waiting for you, Edward, and this time listen to what he has to say. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue." The path to the old farm lake was more difficult than Edward had imagined. The property, once belonging to his family, now formed part of an immense agro-industrial complex. Marcus Sanders, however, had secured special authorization for them to visit the area, presenting Edward as a researcher interested in the region's hydrography. "According to the plant manager, the lake is about a mile from here," explained the investigator, consulting a map on his cell phone as they walked along a dirt road bordered by cane fields. "Rarely does anyone go there. The plant workers consider it, well, they say it's a haunted place." Edward nodded without surprise. He held Charlie's medallion firmly in his hand, like a talisman. The afternoon sun was beginning to descend on the horizon, painting the sky in orange and purple tones. Beside him, Lucy walked in silence, respecting her uncle's moment of introspection. After almost half an hour of slow walking, due to Edward's physical limitations, they reached a clearing. The cane field suddenly opened up, revealing a body of water surrounded by ancient trees. The lake seemed smaller than in his childhood memories, but no less imposing. Its dark waters, almost black under the declining light, seemed to guard secrets in their depths. "It's exactly as I remember," murmured Edward, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the gentle breeze that blew. "Even that leaning tree. That's where we hung our improvised swing." "I'll leave you alone," said Sanders, perceiving the intensity of the moment. "I'll keep an eye on the path to ensure no one interrupts us." When the investigator moved away, Lucy gently touched her uncle's arm. "Do you want me to step away too?" Edward considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Stay. I might need an anchor in reality." They approached the shore. Edward sat on a flat stone, his eyes fixed on the tranquil surface of the lake. The fatigue from the trip and the walk weighed on his shoulders, but a strange energy kept him alert, expectant. "It was here," he said, pointing to a specific spot in the water. "I swam to there where the water looks darker. Suddenly I felt as if something pulled me down. It wasn't a cramp nor a normal current. It was as if the lake itself wanted to swallow me." Lucy sat beside him, listening attentively. The wind gently stirred the leaves of the surrounding trees, creating a soft, melancholic melody. "I remember shouting for help," continued Edward, his voice choked with emotion. "And then I saw Charlie swimming in my direction. He seemed so determined, so strong. Despite being smaller than me, he managed to push me to the shore, but when I tried to reach him—" Edward couldn't finish the sentence. The memories were too painful, even after so many decades. He closed his eyes, feeling hot tears stream down his wrinkled face. "It wasn't your fault, Uncle," said Lucy softly, placing her hand on his. "You were a child. You couldn't know what would happen." "But Charlie knew," replied Edward, opening his eyes to face the lake again. "According to Mrs. Constance, he predicted everything, and yet he came with me, yet he risked himself to save me." A heavy silence fell over them. The sun was rapidly disappearing now, and the first stars began to dot the sky. Suddenly, Edward felt a sweet aroma in the air, the same he had perceived. In his room at the mansion, the same Lucy described having felt in the office. "Do you smell that?" he asked, looking around. Lucy nodded, her eyes wide. "The sweet smell, like honey and wildflowers." Edward stood up with effort, still holding the medallion. The surface of the lake, previously perfectly calm, began to ripple slightly, as if an invisible breeze touched it. And then, on the opposite shore, a figure slowly materialized. It was the boy, the same one who had appeared in the hospital, the same one from the mysterious drawings in the mansion. Barefoot, with simple clothes, disheveled brown hair, and intensely green eyes. Eyes identical to Mrs. Constance's. "Charlie," whispered Edward, his voice almost inaudible. The boy smiled, a smile that Edward would recognize anywhere at any time, a smile that carried pure friendship, unwavering loyalty. "You came," said the boy, his voice echoing strangely, as if coming from very far away, despite the short distance that separated them. "I'm here," replied Edward, suddenly feeling as if he too were 12. Years old again. "I took too long, didn't I?" Charlie's smile widened. "Time is different for me now. But yes, you took your entire life to come back." Lucy observed the scene in absolute silence, unable to move. Part of her wanted to believe. She was witnessing a shared hallucination, provoked by stress and exhaustion. But her heart knew the truth. There was something inexplicable, something marvelous happening there. "Why now?" asked Edward, repeating the question he had asked Mrs. Constance. "Why did you bring me back after so long?" Charlie's countenance became more serious. "Because it was the right time. Your life took a course it shouldn't have. You built an empire based on fear and coldness, when you should have been a builder of bridges between people." Edward lowered his head, feeling the weight of those words. It was true. His entire adult existence had been dedicated to accumulating power and wealth, always at the cost of genuine relationships. "The boy I knew," continued Charlie, "had a generous heart. He shared his lunch with me even when his family forbade. He defended the weaker ones even when it meant defying his grandfather. That boy still exists within you, Edward. He just stayed dormant for too long. Like how you were in a coma, murmured Lucy, finally understanding. Charlie looked at her as if noticing her presence for the first time. Exactly. Sometimes we need a long sleep to truly awaken. Edward took a hesitant step toward the boy. You really sacrificed yourself for me that day. Charlie's expression softened. It wasn't a sacrifice, Edward. It was a choice. I knew what would happen, knew that my life would change forever. But I also knew that one day you would need me again. How is this possible? Asked Edward, gesturing to the boy's figure. How can you be here, exactly as you were 50 years ago? Some places are special, replied Charlie, looking around. This lake isn't ordinary. The ancient Native Americans who inhabited this region called it the mirror between worlds. My father told me about it, and his father before that. Our family always knew there was something magical here. Edward looked at the dark waters, recalling the supernatural sensation he had experienced when nearly drowning. It wasn't just panic. There was something more, something inexplicable pulling him into the depths. When I jumped to save you, continued Charlie, I made a request to the spirit of the lake. I offered my mortal life in exchange for yours. But the lake didn't want a life, it wanted a guardian. Someone who could transit between worlds, protecting those who needed it. So you became... what exactly? Asked Lucy, finding courage to participate in that surreal conversation. The boy smiled at her. There isn't a precise word in your language. Guardian, perhaps. Protector. Someone who helps repair broken paths, reconnect lost souls with their true destinies. And I was your mission, concluded Edward, with a certainty that came from the depths of his soul. My most important mission, confirmed Charlie. I observed you for decades, Edward. I saw your choices, your mistakes, your loneliness disguised as power. When the accident happened and you entered a coma, I knew it was my chance. I could finally reach you in a way you would understand. In the hospital, began Edward. Yes, I managed to manifest physically for a brief moment, enough to bring you back. The rest of the journey, however, you needed to travel on your own. Edward looked at the medallion in his hand. Your mother kept this for me all these years. Because she knew that one day you would return, replied Charlie. The medallion is more than a memento, Edward. It's a symbol of the pact I made, a reminder that some things are more valuable than power or money. The sky was now completely dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the stars and a crescent moon reflected on the surface of the lake. Strangely, Charlie's figure emanated its own light, soft but constant, like a beacon in the darkness. What happens now? Asked Edward, feeling simultaneously exhausted and invigorated by that impossible encounter. That depends on you, replied Charlie, his smile becoming more enigmatic. My part is fulfilled. I awakened the Edward I knew, the boy with a generous heart who got lost on the way. What you will do with this second chance is your choice. Edward felt the weight of those words. A second chance. That's what had been granted to him, not just a miraculous return from the coma, but an opportunity to correct the course of his life. I don't know where to begin, he admitted, suddenly feeling lost. I built an empire based on values that now seem empty to me. How can I undo decades of misguided decisions? One step at a time, replied Charlie, with the simple wisdom that had always characterized him, even as a child. Start with the most obvious, with what your heart is already telling you. Edward nodded slowly. Yes, he already knew where to begin. The refusal of the deal with the Japanese was just the first step. There was so much to do, so many lives he could positively impact with the resources he had accumulated. Can I ask you something? Said Edward, his voice trembling with emotion. Are you all right? Wherever you are now? Charlie's smile became radiant, illuminating the entire clearing. I am at peace, Edward. My choice brought me a greater purpose than I could have imagined. I've helped many souls besides yours over these decades. Will you disappear now, forever? Charlie shook his head. I'm never really far away, and as long as you carry this, he pointed to the medallion, you carry a bit of me too. In moments of doubt, of darkness, Hold it and remember, the true treasure never sinks. Edward felt hot tears streaming down his face again. I miss you every day, you know. Even when I tried not to think of you, even when I immersed myself in work and ambition to forget, you were always there in the back of my mind. And in the depths of your heart, completed Charlie. That's why I could reach you, even after so long. The boy's figure was beginning to become less distinct now, as if dissolving into the night air. Edward took another step forward impulsively. Don't go yet, he pleaded, feeling again like that 12-year-old boy desperate to hold his friend's hand. I need to go, replied Charlie, his voice now more distant, more ethereal. But it's not a goodbye, Edward. It never will be. Before he could completely disappear, Charlie raised his hand in a final farewell gesture. Remember what you promised me that last day before the lake. You said we would build a boat together one day, big enough to sail around the world. It's never too late to fulfill that promise, even if in a different way than we imagined. And then he was gone. Not with a flash or any dramatic effect, he simply vanished, like the last note of a song that remains in the air even after the instrument has silenced. Edward remained motionless, looking at the empty space where Charlie had been. Beside him, Lucy was also silent, her face marked by tears she hadn't even realized she had shed. You saw him too, Edward finally said, not as a question but as a statement. Yes, she replied simply. I saw. I heard. I felt. Edward breathed, deeply, feeling the night air fill his lungs. It seemed cleaner, more invigorating than any air he had breathed in decades, as if an invisible weight had been removed from his chest. Let's go home, he said, putting the medallion in his pocket. We have a lot of work ahead. As they moved away from the lake, Edward stopped one last time and looked back. For a fleeting instant, he could swear he saw two boys running along the shore, laughing carelessly under the sun of an eternal summer. 6 months passed since the encounter at the lakeside. The Westchester mansion, once a monument to solitary ostentation, now buzzed with renewed energy. Edward's office, transformed into an operations center for what he called the Little Boat Project, daily received dozens of people, from Norton Enterprises executives to representatives of NGOs, and community leaders. The third-quarter spreadsheets are ready, Uncle, announced Lucy, entering the room with a folder of documents. At 35, she had abandoned her career as an architect to dedicate herself fully to the new phase of the family business. The numbers are even better than we predicted. Edward smiled, moving away from the window where he was observing the garden. He no longer needed a cane to walk. Months of intensive physiotherapy had restored much of his mobility. More surprising than his physical recovery, however, was the transformation in his countenance. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now radiated a serene vitality, a determination tempered by compassion. Who would have thought that doing good could be so profitable? He commented with a touch of irony. Richard must be stewing. Lucy laughed, remembering her cousin's explosive reaction when Edward announced the new direction he would give to the family business. Richard had abandoned the company, taking with him several executives of the old guard, certain that the Norton empire would crumble in months under the founder's new, idealistic philosophy. He just launched his own financial consultancy, informed Lucy, leafing through some documents. But he's already lost 3 important clients to us since we announced the microcredit program for small farmers. Edward nodded without surprise. He still hasn't understood that times have changed. Consumers, investors, everyone is more aware. It's not enough just to profit. You need to make a difference. On Edward's desk, between financial reports and architectural projects, rested Charlie's medallion, now attached to a new silver chain. He rarely took it off his neck except when bathing. It had become his talisman, his constant reminder of the purpose that now guided each decision. The people from Horizon Construction have arrived, informed Philip, entering the room after a brief knock on the door. Unlike Richard, the younger cousin had enthusiastically embraced Edward's new vision for the business. They're waiting in the meeting room. Great, replied Edward, standing up. Lucy, can you conduct this meeting? I have another commitment. Now. She nodded, surprised. Of course, but I thought you insisted on personally participating in the discussions about the Riverdale project. Edward smiled mysteriously. And I do. But today I have a special visit. Half an hour later, Edward personally drove his car, something unthinkable in the past, through the streets of the Bronx. He parked in front of a simple but well-maintained building that displayed a discreet sign. Charlie Oliver Community Center. Upon entering the lobby, he was greeted by Mariana Sanders, the center's coordinator. At 42, with curly hair framed by some grey strands and a warm smile, she exuded energy and determination. "Mr. Norton, good to see you," she greeted, extending her hand. "The children are anxious to meet you." "Edward, please," he gently corrected, as he always did. "The Mr. makes me feel even older." Mariana smiled, guiding him through the colorful corridors of the center. On the walls, children's drawings, photographs of activities, and motivational phrases created a welcoming environment. The smell of fresh paint and new wood still hung in the air. The building had been completely renovated just 3 months before, financed by the newly created Little Boat Foundation. "We managed to enroll 15 more children this week," informed Mariana as they walked. "With the new ones, there are already 83 attended by the after-school program." "And the courses for parents?" asked Edward, genuinely interested. "They're full, especially entrepreneurship and financial education. We had to open a waiting list." They arrived at a large, well-lit room where about 20 children between 8 and 12 years old were seated in a circle. In the center, a white-haired lady read aloud, gesturing animatedly to illustrate the story. Edward recognized her immediately, Mrs. Constance. After the meeting in Riverdale, Edward had maintained frequent contact with Charlie's mother. 2 months ago, he had managed to transfer her to a retirement home in New York, much more comfortable, and close to the community center he had just inaugurated. And then the boy said, "I'm not afraid to dream big, because dreams are little boats that take us to distant places," read Mrs. Constance, her voice fragile but full of emotion. Edward remained at the door, not wanting to interrupt. The children were completely absorbed in the story, one he knew well as he had helped write it. The Adventures of Charlie and Eddie had become the first in a series of children's books published by the Foundation, with all profits going to, say, social projects. When the reading ended, the children applauded enthusiastically. It was then that one of the boys noticed Edward at the door and nudged the colleague beside him. In seconds, all heads turned in his direction. "It's him," exclaimed a little girl with colorful braids. "The man from the book." Edward smiled, entering the room. "Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm not interrupting story time." "We just finished." "This one?" replied Mrs. Constance with a knowing smile. "But perhaps you'd like to tell the next adventure." The children shouted in approval, quickly reorganizing the circle to make room for Edward. He sat in one of the small chairs, adjusting himself awkwardly, which provoked little giggles. "Today I'll tell you a special story," he began, taking the medallion from his neck and holding it for all to see. "The story of this magical amulet and the boy who possessed it." For almost an hour, Edward narrated a simplified and adapted version of his story with Charlie. The children listened attentively, fascinated by the narrative of friendship, sacrifice, and redemption. When he finished, a reverent silence hung over the room for a few moments. "Was the boy Charlie real?" finally asked a boy of approximately 10 years old, with curious eyes behind glasses too large for his face. Edward exchanged a quick glance with Mrs. Constance before answering, "As real as you and me. And you know what else? He's still out. They're helping people who got lost find their way back." "Like a guardian angel?" suggested another child. "Something like that," agreed Edward, putting the medallion back around his neck. "Someone who reminds us that it's never too late to fix our mistakes and make a difference." After the storytelling session, Edward accompanied Mrs. Constance to the small garden at the back of the community center. They sat on a bench under the shade of a young plum tree, watching some children play in the newly planted educational garden. "You look well," commented the elderly woman, studying him with those intense green eyes so similar to her son's. "I am," confirmed Edward. "Better than I've been in my entire adult life." Mrs. Constance smiled, satisfied. "Charlie would be proud." not just for the community center or the other projects, but for you having found your way back. Edward nodded, instinctively touching the medallion. I still feel him nearby sometimes, not like that night at the lake, but small signs, a scent in the air, a book that falls from the shelf open exactly to the page I need to read, a sudden idea that solves an apparently unsolvable problem. He always had a particular way of communicating, agreed Mrs. Constance with a nostalgic smile. Even as a child, he spoke more through gestures and actions than with words. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the sounds of children playing and birds in the trees. It was impressive how in just 6 months they had developed such a close, almost familial relationship. Edward visited Mrs. Constance at least twice a week, often just to hear stories about Charlie as a child, precious details that helped fill the gaps in his own memories. "I brought something to show you," said Edward finally, taking a large envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. "The final projects for Riverdale." Mrs. Constance took the papers with slightly trembling hands. Inside the envelope were detailed architectural drawings of an educational complex on the shores of the old farm lake. The project, titled Charlie, Oliver Institute for Environmental Education, included classrooms, laboratories, accommodations, and an extensive preservation area around the lake. "It's beautiful," she murmured, looking in wonder at the images. "And are you really buying?" "That entire area from the plant," Edward nodded. "The contract was signed yesterday. We'll begin the restoration of the riparian forest next month. In 2 years, if everything goes according to plan, the institute will be fully functioning." The elderly woman discreetly wiped a tear that ran down her wrinkled face. "You know, what's most incredible? Charlie drew something like this when he was 10, a place where children could learn about nature, about respecting rivers and forests." "I remember," replied Edward, smiling. "We called it the Forest Fort. We were going to be the guardians of the trees and animals." Mrs. Constance laughed, softly. "You two, always full of big dreams." "And now we have the chance to realize them," completed Edward, "even if in a different way than we originally imagined." The sun was beginning to set when Edward finally said goodbye to Mrs. Constance and the children at the community center. On the way home, he decided to take a detour. He parked the car near Central Park and walked slowly to the artificial lake. In the center of the park. It wasn't the same lake, obviously. It didn't possess that mystical aura, that connection with the past he had felt in Riverdale. But there was something comforting in the water, reflecting the orange sky of dusk, something that always attracted him in moments of reflection. He sat on a bench near the shore, observing some ducks swimming lazily. He removed the medallion from his neck and held it against the light of the setting sun, making the old silver shine as if it were alive. "We're building that boat, Charlie," he murmured to the apparent emptiness, "not exactly as we planned that summer, but big enough to take many people to better places." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the surrounding trees, and for an instant, just a brief moment, Edward could swear he heard a familiar laugh, crystalline like running water. He smiled, putting the medallion away again. As he stood up to continue his walk, he noticed something unusual on the surface of the lake, a small paper boat sailing alone against the wind toward the center. No one seemed to have launched it. No child was close enough to be responsible. Edward observed the little boat for a few seconds until it disappeared in the golden light of the setting sun. He didn't need more confirmation than that. The true treasure never sinks. It continues sailing in our hearts, guiding us to deeper, more meaningful waters. With light steps, Edward resumed his path. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of challenges and opportunities. The journey he had begun